Let's see. If intracellular iron levels are optimal, would ferritin levels decline or be below normal? So there's no such thing as measuring intracellular iron. There's no test that actually measures intracellular iron. So that question actually is a little bit misleading, Juan. You can measure serum iron. You can measure ferritin, which is a measure of stored iron in the liver. Those are the big ways that you can measure iron. And then you can measure iron somewhat indirectly by looking at hemoglobin, hematocrit, mean corpuscular volume, and mean corpuscular hemoglobin concentration. Those are typical markers on a red blood cell indices or on a complete blood count. So when your doctor runs what's called a CBC, those markers are generally there. And so you can learn a lot about iron from those particular markers, but there's no intracellular iron test that can be done. Let's see here. So Victoria wants to know, I know you said not to eat lectins in your book, but what about various lentil pastas, safe or not? Depends on where you're at, Victoria. The whole issue with lentils and lectins and beans, so lentils, let's just put beans, and we have these lectins, and lectins are plant proteins. They're century plant proteins. They're designed to help preserve the life of the plant to prevent predators from eating the plant to extinction. And so what happens is a lot of people, when they're first going on that no grain, no pain diet and lifestyle, their guts are compromised. So they have a compromised gut, meaning that lectins can penetrate through into the bloodstream. And when that happens, they can wreak havoc systemically, creating joint pain and inflammation. If you don't have a compromised gut, in essence, if you don't have a leaky gut and your gut health is really great, you're having bowel movements 1 to 2 times a day and they're well formed and normal and there's no blood in your stool and you don't suffer with indigestion or digestive problems, then that's a strong indicator that your gut's not compromised and you might be able to tolerate beans and lectins just fine. However, that being said, I wouldn't use beans or lentils specifically unless they were properly prepared. So pressure cooked so that there's no crunch. You should never eat a bean and get a crunch. That means they're undercooked. That means the likelihood that these guys here are much stronger and going to create more of an issue is much higher. Raw beans are a bad idea. Poorly cooked beans are a bad idea. What you can do with lentils and beans is you can soak them. Generally speaking, anywhere from 24 to 48 hours of soaking, where you soak them for 12 hours, drain them, soak them some more, drain them again. So drain them and soak them 3 to 4 times, up to 48 hours, depending on the type of bean. What that helps do is it helps wash some of this away. And then when you pressure cook them or use high temperatures to cook them down so that the bean is more mushy as opposed to crunchy, then what you're doing is you're breaking down more of these lectins and other plant compounds that can be problematic for your digestive tract. So that's hopefully answers your question on lentils and beans and why I have people avoid them, especially in the first couple of phases. That first 30 days is critical to avoid them. But really, in my clinical experience, the first 6 months is really what you want to do to get a solid foundation where your GI tract is working really, really well. And some people have to go even longer because of the gluten-induced damage, the long-term damage to the GI tract that has led to some scarring or some potential flattening of the villi within the GI tract. And those individuals oftentimes can never bring these back in. So it just depends on who you are and what your outlook is there. Let's see here. Mary says, I found out I had celiac sprue when I was almost 39, and I know that I've had it since I was, okay, not a question there. What, in addition to gluten-free, low-carb diet, can help reverse insulin resistance? Oh, great question. So one of the things is chromium. So micronutrients. What we didn't do here is I didn't tell you the biochemistry behind this diagram. So, for example, aside from food, right, you can change your food. Well, what can you change in these 6 steps here? Well, step number 2, this step requires vitamin D. So how can we get more vitamin D? We can eat mushrooms, we can get more sunshine, right? We need vitamin D because in order for glucose to talk to your pancreas, that occurs through vitamin D receptors. You need vitamin D to do that. Step 3, insulin, is the production of insulin, which requires The micronutrient magnesium, it requires zinc. So you need zinc and you need magnesium to properly produce insulin. Zinc actually holds insulin together. So if you don't have adequate zinc, what happens is you produce insulin that doesn't work very well. It's not as effective. This receptor, this insulin receptor, is made out of chromium and niacin, which is vitamin B3. Okay? And so if you are B3 deficient or chromium deficient, then what will happen is your insulin receptor won't work very well. And so you can make all the insulin you want, but think of insulin as a key. Think of this insulin receptor as the keyhole on the door. And if you have a key, but there's nowhere to put it, right, then you're still out of business. And if you have a keyhole, but you don't have a key that works, then you're still out of business. So these two things are equally critical, the chromium, the niacin, the magnesium, the zinc. Then we have this, what's called intracellular communication. This is where, those of you who studied biology or biochemistry, if you ever remember hearing your professor talk about what's called a second messenger, calcium is a second messenger, one of the most prolific ones. So calcium actually helps to deliver the message. So once that chromium forms that insulin receptor and insulin docks here, it sends a message through the cell, and calcium is who delivers that message. So again, you're asking me, what else can you do to improve your insulin sensitivity? You make sure your calcium levels, your chromium, your niacin, your magnesium, your zinc, your vitamin D, you can make sure those levels of nutrients are adequate. This is why you guys hear me talk about this a lot. Get your nutritional status evaluated. It is fundamental. And if you don't start there, it doesn't matter what drug you take. All it's doing is serving to alter or manipulate your biochemistry in a way that's favorable at suppressing your symptoms without addressing the underlying reason your symptom exists. And that's, to me, it's an effort, it's an exercise in futility. Once we get here, so last thing, so this requires, the energy production part requires CoQ10 and B vitamins and copper and iron, and it requires vitamin C. Like, those are the main nutrients that are required to generate the energy. Once we get the glucose into the cell, to generate the energy, we need these nutrients in mass. So those are things you can do. The other thing that you can do to improve your insulin sensitivity and your glucose outlook is exercise. Maintaining good, proper muscle mass. Because the more mass you have, muscle mass increases production of the insulin receptor. So that insulin receptor, the more muscle you have, the more of these receptors you have, and the better those receptors work. And when you have a lot of receptors that work really well, your pancreas doesn't have to work as hard at making so much insulin. So your pancreas can kind of cruise as opposed to struggle working to try to keep up with the demand. So build your lean muscle. You don't have to become a bodybuilder, but lean muscle, Tabata style workouts, high intensity interval training with minimal weights. You just really need body weight exercise to really build lean muscle, but you have to be consistent and show up every day to get it done. Let's see here. Larissa, if I'm hypothyroid and don't have Hashimoto's, will gluten still affect my thyroid directly? Possibly. If you're gluten sensitive, it very well could. A lot of people have a hypothyroid and they've never been diagnosed with Hashimoto's just because the doctors never run the antibody test. So it might depend on how you were diagnosed with low thyroid. If your doctor never ran antibody tests, you might not even know that you have Hashimoto's. If he did run them and you didn't have it, can gluten affect them? In time, it can. It's not necessarily that you eat gluten once and then you automatically have high thyroid antibodies. For many people, it's the gluten exposure year after year after year that leads to the buildup of antibody production. Let's see. Donna says, I don't have a kitchen at the moment. It seems almost impossible to be gluten-free while eating out. Any suggestions? Yeah, I mean, if it were me, like when I find myself without a kitchen directly, if I'm traveling or something along those lines, I pick up easy foods, things like fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, and make a salad. So like I can take some pumpkin seed and some like chard and some spinach and I can even, if you're talking about unavailability, there's certain stores where you can buy like cooked chicken breast with just cooked in olive oil and salt or garlic or something like that. And you can put that over a salad and just get real stoic about your diet. It may not taste as good as it would if you were at home cooking, but when I'm traveling and on the road, that's what I do. I eat a lot of jerky, I eat nuts, and I'm just a little bit more stoic about my diet, knowing that when I get home, I'll be able to get more of that flavor. But you know, when you're limited to whether or not you have a kitchen, that can be tough. Let's see. Barbara wants to know, is the Dutch test a good starting point to evaluate hormones? No, a Dutch test is not a good starting point to evaluate hormones. It's a good secondary point. It's a really good question because you want to evaluate hormones. The best way to evaluate hormones is to evaluate this. Okay, because what did I say earlier? Hormones are made from these things. And if let's say you get a Dutch test and your cortisol is abnormal or your estrogen's abnormal, what's the next question that you should be asking? You should be asking, why is my hormone level abnormal, right? And the Dutch doesn't tell you why. It tells you that it is normal or abnormal, but it doesn't tell you why. So what you really want to know are these things, right? Because these things will help you to understand the chemistry of whether or not you even have the nutritional chemistry to be able to produce your own hormones. So this would be the primary way I would say it's important to evaluate your nutritional status to know whether or not you even have the capacity to make your own hormones, because otherwise the Dutch is just going to lead some doctor to want to prescribe you hormone therapies or supportive therapies that don't address the underlying reason why your hormones might be abnormal. Can hereditary hemochromatosis make the effects of gluten intolerance worse? Yes, it can. It can, because hemochromatosis is, you get an elevation of iron, and that's very inflammatory. So you compile that with the inflammation caused as a result of gluten exposure, and you've got two things damaging you instead of one. So if you're gluten sensitive and your diet's gluten free, then no, it's not necessarily going to impact that. It'll only impact you if you're not adhering to your diet. How long do you have to hold supplements prior to testing for nutritional deficiencies? You mean how long do you have to hold off on taking supplements? I'm going to assume that's what you meant, Sharon. You don't if you do the right testing. So this goes back to methodology. A lot of doctors want to do serum tests. Serum tests aren't super accurate for nutritional status because they're a reflection of your last meal or your last stressful drive in the car, right? So we don't want a test that's going to give us like a snapshot. We want a test that's going to give us like this really long window of time. Just like with blood sugar, doctors use hemoglobin A1C to measure your blood sugar average over time. We want to do that same thing with nutrition. This is why we look at intracellular levels. So again, talk with your doctor about intracellular versus serum levels, and that will be very helpful to get an assessment. And if you're doing an intracellular test, you don't have to stop taking your supplements to get an accurate result. You stay on your supplements, and this test will show you how well they've been working. Did they work? Right? Are your supplements, if you've been taking zinc for 6 months and you're zinc deficient, you can look at your bottle of zinc and probably say, this is probably not a very good product, or there's something else going on that's preventing me from absorbing the zinc in this product. Okay, so Jennifer's asking, she says, I'm hypothyroid and adrenal and cortisol depleted. I'm taking adrenal supplements. Her question is, can taking T3 be a problem? I take nature thyroid and I get fatigue. I also take iodine. It depends, Jennifer. That's kind of a pretty complex question because there's a lot of other variables and factors that could go in. I could ask you another 100 questions based on that question that you're posing to me. But the simplest way to answer it is, yes, T3 can be a problem if your cortisol is low and your adrenal glands are fatigued. T3 is like, think of your adrenal glands as a very tired horse, and you've got your boots, your spurs on, and that horse is ready. It's done riding for the day, but you just keep spurring it on. Eventually, it's going to collapse, and that's what T3 does to the adrenal glands. It pushes the adrenal glands. So if the adrenal glands can't meet the demand, then it can actually have the antithesis of the effect that you're looking for, which is if you're taking your thyroid medication and it's wiping you out or exhausting you, then you might want to talk to your doctor about making some changes along that line, because it can overwork your adrenal glands, and if your adrenal glands are already overworked, it can exacerbate your problem and you won't feel better. So Kimberly wants to know what I eat. Grass-fed elk that's been fed minimal oats as well. I think you have to define minimal oats for me to give you an answer to that question. If there was an occasional feeding of oat, I probably wouldn't look at that as any great risk to my health. However, if, like on many of these hunting acreages where you can go and hunt, a lot of, like here in Texas, they put out corn feeders, and they're spinning corn, genetically modified corn, all over, and the deer are just up there eating during deer season. That I would not eat. So it just depends on what you mean by minimally fed oats. Let's see here. So Mary says, with having celiac disease, I have osteoporosis at a young age. A doctor wants me to take a pill to make my bones stronger. Should I take it? Well, first of all, I can't give you medical advice, Mary. This really is a question for your doctor, but I can say, and maybe we can put a link up to one of our past shows for you on, it's called Bone Scan Myths. And I think, Mary, best place to start would be to watch that video to get a good idea for the answer or the education that I think you should have, so that you can have an intelligent conversation with your doctor before just being told to take a pill. Because a lot of those pills don't strengthen your bone. They make it look better on a bone scan, but they actually make your bone more brittle. That's why one of the long-term side effects of taking the bisphosphonate class of medication is they cause microfractures of the jaw. And you don't want that. That's called osteonecrosis of the jaw. You don't want that, because then you won't be able to chew your food. And when you can't chew your food, you become even more malnourished and your bones deteriorate even faster. So, have that conversation with your doc and watch that video. Let's see, Van, what's the best food to keep the calcium phosphate ratio in favor of calcium? Lots of foods. I mean, maybe be more specific about what else you're trying to achieve. I'm not even quite sure what you mean, because you have to understand that there's calcium and phosphate in a lot of the foods that you eat, and it's not, if you're eating natural foods versus, let's say, supplementing, you're not so much worried about a favorable ratio in the favor of calcium. Butisse wants to know, can DNA gluten test be used for testing vitamin and mineral deficiency? No, so a gluten DNA test is only going to tell you whether or not you're reactive to gluten, but it's not going to give you a definitive on whether or not you have nutritional deficiency. Now, if you are reactive to gluten and you're struggling in your health, then there's a strong likelihood that you'll have gluten-induced malnutrition, but the test itself is not going to tell you what vitamins and minerals that you are deficient in. Let's see, Stephanie wants to know, why does free T4 show low? That's your issue. So there's a lot of reasons why T4 can be low. If we look at it from a nutritional perspective, so again, if we're talking about vitamins, minerals, macronutrients, T4, if we just break the chemistry down, the 4 equals iodine. The T is tyrosine, which is an amino acid. And so some people don't get enough tyrosine in their diet. Some people don't get enough iodine in their diet. Your body will take tyrosine and 4 molecules of iodine, and it will put them together. Now, to do that, that requires vitamin B2, and it requires vitamin C. So you need vitamin B2 and you need vitamin C to build T4. Okay, so a lot of times when T4 is low, it's because you don't have one of these nutrients. Very, very common. Another reason why T4 could be low is that your gluten, you're creating antibodies that are attacking your T4, and your body can't meet the demand or continue to produce. So, those would be some of the more common reasons why T4 might be low. Let's see. Addie wants to know, can you discuss the correlation between heat intolerance and gluten sensitivity and autoimmunity? So if you're intolerant to heat, there's a lot of reasons why you can be intolerant to heat. But one of the biggest, there's actually a couple different actual autoimmune conditions. One is called erythromelalgia, which is where gluten can damage the valves in the blood vessels. And when gluten damages those valves in the blood vessels, and the blood gets stuck and it pools, and you can become intolerant to heat. For that reason, you can become intolerant to heat as a result of systemic nutritional deficits. So nutrition, remember, part of how we regulate our temperature and regulate our ability to adapt to any environment is going to be largely through our nutritional status. And so again, gluten, one of the biggest ways that gluten impacts people and creates or triggers autoimmune disease, aside from an immune response directly, is through malnutrition. It causes malnutrition, which makes the body struggle to maintain doing what it's supposed to be able to do, what we call homeostasis, where the body has this ability to regulate temperature and to regulate movement and sleep and all these things you don't have to think about. You don't have to think about when your heart beats or how fast it beats. It just happens, right? That those homeostatic mechanisms are largely under the influence of these nutrients. And so again, if you are malnourished as a result of gluten exposure, that definitely could be one of the reasons why we're struggling with heat. Let's see. There's also demyelinization issues that can occur with heat intolerance. So like B12 deficiency, which is the second most common deficiency in gluten sensitivity, can cause demyelinization of your nerves, leading to a change in the way you perceive temperature, which can cause inability to tolerate heat very well. We see that oftentimes in people that develop multiple sclerosis. Let's see. What does it mean when the good cholesterol goes up with the bad cholesterol? Nothing. I would say that if you don't understand that there's no such thing as bad cholesterol, then I would encourage you, Ellen, to go back and watch. I've got a really good video on cholesterol that I think would give you a lot of better insight than what we have time to answer very briefly in tonight's show. So I would encourage you to go, and if you don't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and just type in cholesterol on my channel in the search box, and you'll pull up several shows that I've done in depth on cholesterol, because it's going to require a lot more time than what we have tonight. If you think you developed gluten sensitivity because of poor diet, nutrition deficiencies, with a genetic test still be the test to take to confirm the sensitivity? You don't develop gluten sensitivity because of a poor diet. You either are gluten sensitive genetically or you're not. So understand, gluten sensitivity is not a disease, it's a state of genetics. You either have the genes or you don't have the genes. Now, for some people, the actual symptoms of gluten sensitivity develop later in life for factors, different factors. So for example, if you eat poorly and you're malnourished, you might manifest the symptoms of gluten sensitivity earlier in your life as opposed to later in your life as a result of you being malnourished. If you don't exercise, if you eat poorly, if you have a history of taking a lot of antibiotics and a lot of other medications that affect the GI tract, then you're going to increase your risk of developing the symptoms of gluten sensitivity earlier in life as opposed to later in life. Because gluten, for most people, it takes about 3 decades for women, 4.5 decades or so for men to really start seeing the symptoms manifest badly enough, like severely enough, where they make a trip to the doctor to try to learn what's going on with their bodies. Let's see, Amanda says, what can I do to help with low libido after cutting gluten out? So if you're, now let's clarify, Amanda, are you following a gluten-free diet, a traditional gluten-free, or are you following no grain, no pain? Because if you're not here, this is what else you can do. Phase 2, no grain, no pain diet, okay? Beyond that, check especially your nutrient status, especially checking nutrients like inositol and zinc and magnesium, because these are very, very critical for hormone. Those nutrients are very critical for hormone regulation, and again, low libido related to hormone dysfunction. You could have some nutritional deficiencies that are playing a role in that low libido. Let's see, Janet says, would like to get rid of hot flashes. Have incurred for almost 12 years, had amalgams removed last year, and started heavy metal chelation last year with a layover with COVID. Lost 15 pounds of the 35 I put on with removal of grains. So I guess the question is, how can you get rid of hot flashes? Really, with that, you've got to identify the underlying reason as to why they exist. And for many, if you're not really truly going through menopause, then there's something else. There's another toxic burden that you're probably struggling with. So working with that same doctor, it sounds like you're working with a doc already to help understand what other toxic burden you might be working with would be what I would strongly suggest that you do. Victoria says, what tests do you recommend to get the proper understanding of whether or not you have a gluten sensitivity issue? Genetic testing. Can we throw up a link for genetic testing for Victoria on Facebook? She's interested in learning a little bit more about that. Okay. Is it normal to still have hot flashes with a partial hysterectomy? Wow, 8 years ago, have all these symptoms you mentioned? No, it's really not. Something else is going on, Dory. Again, I would look to everything that we talked about tonight and just going in and having a deep conversation. Now, I said earlier in the beginning of the show tonight that I was going to put a link up to a very in-depth and very well-researched article. It's about a 2,000-word article, but I'm linking to all the different research studies based on what we're talking about here tonight. So if you want to have an intelligent conversation with your doctor and you want some evidence to take in with them, make sure you go visit Gluten Free Society. That link should be up. Mel, can we put that? I put it up, I think, already on Facebook or on YouTube, but I didn't put it up on Facebook. But go check out that link, because that's where all these medical references and research studies are going to be listed out for you as well, so that you can have that information to have that conversation. So Kimberly comes back and says, no corn, just non-GMO oats. However, mostly grass is fed to the elk. So going back to the elk question, again, then I would just go down to quantity. Is it daily? Because if it's daily use, I wouldn't. That wouldn't be something I would consume. The whole premise of eating wild game is that you're getting a really high omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, and that you're alleviating a lot of the marbling in the meat that those grains can cause. And it's that type of fat that's been linked to heart disease, not animal fat, but again, improper animal fat when grains are used to fatten up animals. But again, you have to make that call based on how much quantity-wise those elk are actually eating. Okay, I think we're out of time. Still got more questions, but we're going to have to wrap it up. So thanks again for sharing your Monday with me. I hope this was helpful. As a matter of fact, this was helpful. Give me some thumbs up and let me know that you guys appreciate and that are learning from what we're publishing for you. And make sure, too, that you come by and visit me at glutenfreesociety.org. Drop your name and email there. We'll send you a ton of wonderful free information about how to navigate a true gluten-free lifestyle. And if you aren't sure about gluten, not sure whether or not you need to go gluten-free, check the link out below. There's a free quiz that you can take. And within that quiz, you can get kind of an answer as to whether or not you need to further investigate the potential possibility of whether or not gluten is playing a role in your health issues. This is Dr. Osborne wishing you an excellent week. We'll see you next Monday night, same time, 6 p.m. Central Standard. Have a fantastic evening. Hey, if you've got a functional medicine or health question that you'd like me to answer for you, make sure you send me an email, glutenology@gmail.com, and we'll do our best to create a video answer just for you. Have a great day.